Hello.
Hi there.
Welcome. I'm Howard Scott Warshaw. Thank you. Appreciate it. For you who don't know, I used to work at Atari. I made Yars' Revenge, Raiders of the Lost Ark, E.T., Saboteur. I noticed there were a few chirps for E.T. Fewer than some of the other ones. That's okay. I'm also a psychotherapist, as some of you people may know, and I was a video producer also for a while, and I made a series called Once Upon Atari. I wanted to show you a brief promo thing for that. And this is beautiful. Maybe I didn't really want to show it to you anyway.
Yes, you did.
So, that's not happening.
Just act it out.
Yeah. Take it out and blow on it.
Well, actually, some of the people who are in Once Upon Atari are actually here today, so that's kind of exciting. And Mr. Todd Fry. And Mr. Rob Zadibble. Mr. Bob Smith, who would have been in it. So it's just, for some reason, this is not happening. So we will forego that part of our talk. But I do have some copies of the DVD, which will be available. I brought my autographs with me also, just in case. So after the talk, we'll have some time for autographs, and I'll have a limited number of the DVDs for sale if you're interested. And there you go. So, that E.T. thing. Right? So what's up with that? E.T. was a very interesting setup here. Why don't you go ahead? Let's travel. There we go. Just a little more intimate. Because intimacy is what I'm all about these days. So, and talk about intimacy. So many people felt screwed by E.T. But E.T. was an interesting experience. It was a very interesting experience for me, and then the legacy that it left, because when I did E.T., it was a game that was done in 5 weeks. 5 weeks and 1 evening, actually, technically, because I found out I was supposed to do E.T. the evening of July 27th, and it was delivered for September 1st, so it could make the Christmas market. Otherwise, if we missed the Christmas market, the game might not succeed. Right? So it's very important to make that, to hit that window. So we did. And a lot of people say this is the worst game of all time. Do you disagree?
Yes.
Well, I got to tell you, I don't disagree with anyone who really believes it's the worst game of all time, because every player is entitled to their opinion. Thank you very much, by the way. I really appreciate it. And everyone's entitled to their opinion, and that's okay. I happen to believe that a lot of the people who say E.T. is the worst game of all time have never played it, because E.T. has probably become like a lightning rod for haters in some ways. But you know, that's an accomplishment too. Because I'm a very positive outlook kind of individual. So I've always been very happy with what happened with E.T. It's a game that got done in 5 weeks. And that was no easy task. And it was a game that had some interesting features. And so, how many of you saw the Nerd movie last night? Woo! Okay, so at the end of it, even the angry video game nerd said that it wasn't the worst video game of all time. I found that very vindicating. But actually, I prefer when people call it the worst video game of all time. I kind of like having that, because I also did Yars' Revenge, frequently cited as one of the best video games of all time.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. But I figure between E.T. and Yars' Revenge, I have the greatest range of any game design in history. And so I feel good about that. So I have, I have 2 games of note. I have one that's in the New York Museum of Modern Art, and one that is the subflooring of the New Mexico desert. So range is what I'm really proud of. I like having a range. So, the worst game. of all time. So I carried that for many, many years. People go, what's the matter? You know, what happened? How did you do this? So, you know, it's not anything I do. It's other people. It's up to other people. It's the worst video game of all time. People approved it. People liked it. At the dig, though, I have always been saying that it was not buried, that nobody buried this game. It was not sitting in the desert. I never believed that for a second. And for like literally 30 years, I have been saying, no, it's not there. It's not, no company that's failing financially is going to spend the extra time and money to take product that's obviously worthless if you're going to bury it, and go to the expense of going out in the middle of the desert and burying it. That's crazy. You know, it doesn't make any sense to do that. But what I realized is that when you really think about making sense, you're losing touch with Atari. Because Atari was never about making sense, right? And that's what made Atari an amazing place to be, right? Because it was outrageous. It was unbelievable. We pushed the limits and boundaries in every dimension, in every way. We had the opportunity to act out, and we did. And that was cool. And one of the products of it was a lot of really fun entertainment and video games. And when we were doing the games, one of the most important things to me, everybody has their own idea of what they're making when they're making a game.
Where? I've got a guy.
Oh. So, and what I'm making is, when I'm making a video game, I'm making a piece of broadcast media. That's the way I look at it. There's something about a game that's going to go out to all these people. When a player plays a game, they're going to have some kind of experience. Because of the way you program the game, you design it so that there's certain things you have to do, there's certain tasks you have to execute, there's certain actions you have to make with your controller. And you could look at the success strategy for any game as a series of manipulations and visual experiences and interactions that you have with the screen. That's kind of what a video game is. And that's going to have some impact. And some games have better impact and some games have worse impact. But it's like you encapsulate a message that goes out to people through the play of the game. That's not the way everybody looks at a game, maybe, but that's honestly the way I looked about the game. And I wanted to put out messages that I really enjoyed out to people. So with like Yar's Revenge, the message that I had in mind was visual stimulation, was intense visual and cortical stimulation, if you will. And I also used a lot of movie making principles because I'm a freak for movie making. I love movies and making movies and studying movies. And there were some principles I used in Yar's that were from movie making. The way you use sound, the idea of right, left, up, down. You know, in action movies, a lot of times, if you watch a movie carefully, you'll notice that a lot of action scenes, whenever something enters the screen from the left, the next thing that's going to happen is something's going to come from the right, and then something's going to come from the top, and something's going to come from the bottom. And you keep things coming from different directions. That increases the space that you're perceiving. Okay, so I did so with Yar's Revenge. I invented something where you've got to be moving in one direction and shooting in another direction, and something that's coming in from the other way, and something's chasing you from the other end. And you've got all four dimensions, all four axes playing. Actually, two axes with four sides. So, that was my concept. So for E.T., you know, for Raiders was, you know, the game that doesn't get talked about that much. But Raiders was, again, the concept I had for Raiders was to make the biggest adventure, because I had to make an adventure, and the only adventure really at that point was adventure. The aptly named adventure. You know, Warren Robinette launched a genre. It was an amazing, amazing accomplishment. And so I thought I wanted to do something that was a worthwhile step forward. I didn't want to just do a knockoff of what Warren did. And I really had a lot of respect for what Warren did, so I tried to make the biggest adventure there could be on the VCS. And not with the most screens, but the most different play screens and the different concepts and stuff. And I tried to make a huge game. So with E.T., what was my concept? With E.T., my concept was to design a game that could be done in 5 weeks. Because if you want to design a game in 5 weeks, you don't design a game that would take 6 months to do and try to do that in 5 weeks. Because then you're designing for failure. So what I did was make a game that you could do in 5 weeks and hoped it would be a game. And so, and I built in stuff like the pits, which are the big problem. But the pits were the place where you could randomize the location, and so the hunt and search game, that's basically the essence of the game, could renew and be new and be re-randomized and played each time and run around. And so I wanted to give the game legs, give the game life, ironically enough. And so that was the concept. And I did the game, and laid it out. And I worked harder than I'd ever worked in my life for 5 weeks. And at the end of the 5 weeks, I was so sick of looking at that game. I said, get this thing away from me. And away it went. And things were fine until feedback started to come back and people did not like the game. Well, bummer. But for me, it was still a great achievement to have done the game and finished a game in 5 weeks, although you could argue it wasn't really finished, right? Because what it lacked, the thing that ET lacks, is tuning. If I would have added 5 days, okay, which is virtually 20% of the entire schedule at that point, you know, we could have done some tuning and we could have made some tweaks and I could have fixed a few things probably that could have made it from the jump up from the worst game of all time to another mediocre game, maybe, you know, and we could have got there. But then again, we wouldn't be here right now. So, but the thing in every game that went on, the reason I started this whole diatribe in the first place, was that the underlying message of every game was entertainment. When I grew up as a teenager in the pre-video game days, which is getting hard to remember now, the predominant experience I had in growing up was boredom. I was bored a lot, all the time. And I used to do anything I could think of to alleviate boredom, not always socially acceptable. So when I was making a game, in my head was this idea of I'm trying to give something to people so they won't have to be bored the way I was. I was fixing my problem for them. Really, is it any wonder I became a therapist? And that was the thing. It was like you want to entertain people. And then, so the worst thing about ET for me was that on some levels, I felt like I wasn't entertaining people with this game. I missed. And that felt bad to me. But, and it was a very intense day when we actually went to the dig in Alamogordo. And because on that day, and I get a little worked up over this still. On that day, there was hundreds of people waiting in line to get into a dump. And it was awesome to see people here really focused and excited on ET. Because they wanted to see if ET had actually been dumped into a hole in the ground, right? Whatever. The thing is that 32 years after I made the game, it was still generating excitement. People were still excited, people were here, people were buzzing around. It was generating fun and interest and excitement. And I realized I did it. So that was a great moment for me. A lot of people go, how did it feel seeing your game getting dug up out of the ground? I say, it felt great. It felt great. There it was. And if I would have been alone and stumbled on it and found, oh my God, somebody dumped all these games in the ground, maybe that wouldn't have been as great. But to be there with all these other people at the focus of all this energy and this excitement, and to see everybody pop with this when it came up and the excitement and the fervor that was going on. And I realized that, you know, Yars and Raiders and to some extent Saboteur, those games had all been out and really genuinely entertained people and caused some fun. And it took ET over 3 decades to get to the point where it was creating some fun for people. But here it was. And that was great. That was very meaningful for me. And so the nerd, it was very interesting to me because we created a movie. The nerd came up with a movie about ET, and you know everyone has said, do ET. If you're going to do a game, you got to do the worst game of all time. He saved it for a movie. And in this movie, so I had a part in the movie, and part of my part in the movie was to say, yes, these carts are buried in the desert. That was the first time in 30 years that I had ever said, yes, I believe these carts are here in the desert. And it was in a fictional recreation, right? That's the only way I would say that was true. And then 2 years later, almost to the day, I was there in Alamogordo and we dug it up, and it was true. And there they were. And it's like, I've never been so happy to be wrong in my life. Because I always said there's no way those things are out there. And there's another movie that's made, Atari Game Over. How many of you have heard of this project? Okay, so that's going to be coming out in November, I believe, from Microsoft, where it's going to be available on Xboxes. And that's a movie that's actually the documentary of the excavation and a bunch of other stuff around the whole ET story. It's a very interesting movie. I find it personally fascinating. But that was being in that movie was a very different experience, because that's a straight up documentary. Being in the nerd movie was a whole different thing, because I got to play a different part of me than, although I was very natural in what I got to be in that movie, I got to say something I'd never said before, and it was odd to say it because I totally did not believe it. And yet it turned out to be true. So the nerd made me tell the truth 2 years before I was ready to do it. In one way. So I think in some ways you could say he's an amazing prognosticator, or as I like to say, he's actually Nerdstradamus. So, and Kevin Finn, who's the director of the nerd movie, happens to be here, although I won't pick him out and identify him for you. Because you'll be seeing him very shortly in room A. And we were talking, and we did an interview. It was really excellent. And during it, Kevin really gave me a great idea, a way to look at the whole experience of what went on with E.T. was that, what I realized is, I've become a psychotherapist. I am totally into being a psychotherapist. I love working with gamers, with engineers. That's what I do. I'm a Silicon Valley therapist. And I always, on some levels, knew I was going to wind up in this. Or when I was 17, I was going to come up with my own personality theory. I really had always been interested in this, and then totally got away from it. But another take on what I did with E.T., if you look at all the trauma and depression and anxiety that game caused for people, it's like I think I was just building a market for myself later on in life. So I can talk on about this stuff, or what we could do is start doing a question thing, because I'm always good with just taking questions and responding like that. So do any of you have questions? First of all, if you do, just let me know. Yes?
Yar's Revenge was originally supposed to be a port of Star Castle, from what I had
Exactly,
heard?
yeah.
Okay, so how did that end up changing from being Star Castle into Yar's Revenge?
You ever tried doing Star Castle on 2600 yet?
Actually, it was my professional judgment that it was not a good idea to do Star Castle on 2600. Although it was done subsequently. Has anybody played Star Castle on 2600? I don't think it's a great game, Tom. But it's a good question. So that was kind of a defining experience for me, because this was my first shot at Atari. And what I wanted to do more than anything else in the world was make a really good game. I wanted to make a game that people would really enjoy and really dig. And I thought, okay, it's an action game, and I get to do an action game. And the cool thing about an action game, if you think about it from a game design point of view, doing an action game is very different from doing an adventure game for one specific reason. An action game, I believe, if it's well designed, the designer has no advantage in playing that game over any other player. A really well-designed action game should play the same for the maker of the game as it does for anyone. Adventure games, the maker of the game can never have the experience of a player. And that's a really weird inversion, right? But if you think about it, so action games are much easier to gauge how they're doing, right? Because if you're an action gamer, which I am, I can play my game and I can say, oh, this sucks, or this needs to be fun, I'd like this to be more fun. I can tell how it is. It's hard to gauge an adventure game. But Yar's was an action thing, and I knew right away. I mean, I was like only at Atari for like days at the point when they said, okay, why don't you do this game? And I looked over the game, and I did not know everything about the system, but I knew enough about the system to know this game would suck, in my opinion. I really thought it wasn't going to be a good game. So I went to Dennis Coble, the manager, and I said, Dennis, I really think this game would suck. And this was early enough on at Atari that marketing had not completely taken over, and there weren't people saying, oh my God, if we don't make a game that's already out there, how are we going to sell it? So when I said to him, I think this would suck, but I have another idea for a way to rework it and use some of the same basic play principles, but turn it into like a really more engaging and more fun game. And so, to his credit, he said, yeah, go for it. Give it a shot. And so I started a game that the original working title was Time Freeze, because the one thing that I had in mind for this game that it needed to have was a big payoff sequence. So I had this whole payoff animation sequence in mind, and as many of you know, whenever you try to do any kind of creative project, whatever it is, there's this graph we know that's called the concept graph. And it starts off up here at the beginning of when you're just designing it and you think what it's going to be. And as you work on the project, your design gets lower and lower, and it's percentage of concept realized, right? Until you hope you maintain like 15, maybe 20% of your original concept at the end of the project. That would be a super successful project. So I had a very grand vision, because I hadn't been programming 2600 long enough, to have been beaten into submission. And so I had a whole huge idea for what I wanted to do with that final sequence. And that was about time freeze, because I thought whenever you do what I call the master stroke, there's this one thing you do in a game that's the big thing to do, whether it's beating the boss or beating the biggest enemy. There's something you do that's the big thing to do in the game. And I felt that needed to be paid off with more than just, here's your next screen, away we go. So I had that in mind from the beginning, but I had a much grander idea of what it was. So I kind of left the concept of Star Castle pretty quickly. But the idea of something hiding behind a shield that you have to work your way through to get to, that I held on to. And I redesigned a shield that was more appropriate to 2600 programming. And then I added a different kind of weapon. And then originally in the game, I had a really crappy controller scheme because I was trying to copy the controller scheme from Star Castle. So you won't even say Stargate because I'm such a defender. Nice. And it was really the turning point in the game was when I let go of that controller scheme. And because I let go of that controller scheme, I had to come up with a game mechanic to turn on something in the game, like to activate the Zorlon cannon. And then I realized, wow, when you use gameplay to enable things that happen in the middle of a game, that's a huge thing. So it was a big learning experience for me, very positive. And it was so that's sort of the story. How it became Yar's Revenge is another story that's very interesting. That's how I had to outmarket to try to. And is that an interesting story? You want to hear how Yar's Revenge got its name? Or go back to the ET stuff? Okay, so we'll do the Yar's Revenge thing. Because I love that story. I'm the star of that story. And whenever I tell this story, I come off really, really nicely. So that's good. So get ready. So here's the thing, it's like we had a funny thing at Atari, which was whenever it was time to name a game, because games didn't have names, right? Games were just being done. They were making a game, and when the game was done, we had a game, then we'll put a name on it, we'll send it out and sell it. Okay? Because this was early in games. And they had like really ridiculous, silly, stupid names and stuff. And I wasn't happy with that, so I thought, I want this game to be good. And people were starting to really like Yars. After I made some changes and it really got over my initial stupidity over trying to hold on to some of the elements of Star Castle, which I think were kind of holding me back. Once I let that go and started changing some things in the game, it got really good. People were digging the game. So I thought, okay, this might really be a good game. And I really like everything about this game to be good because I am a creation control freak. And so when I'm making something, I really want to make sure I'm making every part of it as good as I can make it. And yes, I still did E.T. Unbelievable. But, so what happened was I heard they were coming up to the time where they're going to name the game and put it out and do that. And so I got a hold of one of the marketing product managers. And I said, hey, have they named the game yet? And he goes, no. And I said, well, can I submit something? And he goes, well, sure. And I said, okay. I said, I'll have something for you soon. So that night, I stayed at Atari overnight. And I stayed up all night and I wrote a story. First, I tried to think up what a name would be. And I thought, okay, I want to have, there's a couple of things that I get to do in this case that are really kind of cool. One thing I get to do is come up with a title myself. And I thought, okay, for a title, I want an action title for an action game. So I thought revenge. Revenge is always a good action word for a title. Because everybody wants revenge for something at some point. So everyone can identify with revenge. So I thought, it's going to be revenge, because, there's lots of vindictive fantasies, you can fulfill in a situation like this. And then I thought, okay, so who's revenge? And I thought this was another great opportunity in my life. Because one thing I've always wanted to do was add a word to the English language. And so I thought, here's my chance to do that. I'm going to make up a name for something, and if it becomes popular and it really gets out there and runs around, I will have created a new word in the English language, and wow, wouldn't that be cool? for me, I thought that would be really cool because I'm still a nerd. And so I thought, okay, and I started thinking of names. When you're trying to think of a name for a character that's really new, everything you think of is stupid. It's just, oh, that's stupid. It's ridiculous. Oh my God, that's a stupid name. It's hard to come up with a decent name. And then I thought, I'm going to stop trying to make up a name, and I'm going to try and come up with a name that has an Easter egg in it, because I'm very big on Easter eggs. So everything has to have a double, triple hidden meaning and all this kind of stuff. That's very important. So I came up with my little plan. And what it was, because first I had written this story. I had written this story, and I was trying to think of what I'm going to name the character. And the story was about these flies who get caught on a spaceship, and they go out in outer space, and they get irradiated, and they kill all the humans, and now they take over their own solar system, and now there's a monster that's after them. And so, what goes around comes around in the universe, I guess. But what's the name of the character? And I thought, I need leverage. I need some leverage with this. So I thought, okay, Ray Kazar is the CEO of Atari at the time. So I thought Ray spelled backwards is Yar. That works phonetically. Fortunately, he had a good name. You know, that's what Ray came in handy for. You spell his name backwards, it still sounds reasonably like a word. So so I thought there'll be Yars, and it'll take place in the Razak solar system, which is Kazar spelled backwards. And so I thought, there we go, and that's the name, and that's how I named the characters. And I hatched my little plot in my head, and I thought, oh, this is good. So I got the story typed up, and had all stuff set, and the next day, here comes the product manager. I go, hey, here's my submission. He said, we still on time? And he's like, yeah, that's fine. So I gave it to him, and he goes, and he puts it in. And the next day, I see him again, and I said, hey, they decided what they're going to do yet? Nope, not yet. I said, listen, I said, I want to tell you something. I said, but I don't want this to influence the naming of the game. And he's like, okay. And I said, no, really, this has got to be a secret. You've got to promise not to tell anybody. And I made him swear 3 times that he wouldn't tell everyone, so I was sure he would tell everyone. And I told him, I said, you know that Yar thing, the character? I said, what's that spelled backwards? And he goes, Ray. And I go, yeah, and Razak, it's in the Razak solar system, right? He goes, what's that spelled backwards? He's like, Kazar, Ray Kazar. He goes, are you kidding? I said, no. I said, it's Ray Kazar, it's part of the name of the game. He goes, does Ray know about this? I said, well, of course Ray knows about it. I said, I wouldn't do this if Ray didn't know. But that's why I don't want you to tell anybody, because I think it would unfairly influence the submission. And he's like, okay. I said, you won't tell anybody? No. So the next day I run into him again, guess what? What? We're going with Yar's Revenge. I said, there's no question in my mind. He went right back, told everybody, oh my God, Ray knows about this. This is Ray's name, and we got to go with this plan. And you know, Ray had no idea. This was something I had just made up. And so that was kind of fun. And so that was cool. And it also became the first video game that had a backstory, because it became a comic book that was published with the thing. So it was the first time that had been done. They produced additional media along the line of the storyline of the game. So there were a lot of firsts in Yar's Revenge. And I was very proud of that. That was very cool. And then about, several months later, we used to have these press events where we would show up and we'd have to play our game for the press, for the cameras and stuff, and be on these big TVs, which in those days were big TVs, which now are medium-sized TVs. But it was like, and we'd be playing our game, and I was playing Yar's Revenge, and Ray Kazar comes up to me. And he goes, hey, Howard, he goes, I heard what you did with that name thing. I go, really, Ray? I said, well, what did you think about that? He goes, keep making games, Howard. And so that's how Yar's Revenge got its name. I want to do that stuff. I just think that's a fun story. So, are there any other questions? Yes?
Just I want to follow up on Yar's Revenge. Talk about the sound and the sound design of that.
Well, the sound design for Yar's Revenge I think was interesting because there was a couple of things that I really had in mind to do with it. One of them was I wanted to have an ongoing, I wanted to use sound to make the game bigger than you were aware of. That was my idea. Whether I achieved that or not, I don't know. But my idea was that, first of all, how many of you know the term B science fiction? Right? Okay, because I grew up on B science fiction, because in the 1950s, there were a shitload of low-budget, crappy sci-fi movies, and I saw every single one of them. And that's what I would do. I would come home, and I would turn whatever channel had the B sci-fi on, and I would watch that You know, I was one of those people who watched like 6 hours of TV a day, 7 if there was anything good on. I was always watching TV, and that's what I liked to watch, was any kind of, you know, B sci-fi stuff. And so, and in a lot of those movies, you'd have the mad scientist in the lab, and you'd have the arcing electrodes, right, over the thing to show the big powers going on here and stuff. And there was that sound. I can't really do it very well. But it's, there's that sound, that arcing electric sound, and you'd see the little electric bolt, you know, rising up. That was a very iconic thing back in B sci-fi. And I thought, that's what I want to have. So I started with that as like that was like the heartbeat of the monster. That was this basic thing that was always going on. And then there was the idea of there were pacing. There are things, as you get closer to stuff or farther from stuff, the volume changes a little. And there's also, there's a cue you get in sound before the monster changes to the swirl and before it fires. So there are things that happen in the game that cue you to what's going on in the game, but I don't know if you always get aware of it, but it elevates tension while you're playing the game. And so these were the kind of things that I did. I also, another thing that I did for yours, it wasn't strictly sound design, but I made the game with no frame. A lot of people put frames around their games. That was a very standard thing to do. On the basis you put a frame and you put your score at the bottom or the top, and the game plays in the frame. And what I pictured was having a black background and no frame, because the way I pictured playing a video game was at night in the dark. You turn off all the lights, you turn your game, and here's you play your game. Which means when you have a black screen, it melts into the background and it feels bigger. It's going to feel like it's part of the room instead of just sitting in a frame. And so I just liked that idea. And so I did that. And the sound combined with that, I think, really gave it a bigger feel in some ways. At least that was my intention. Does that answer your question?
Yes, and it worked.
Oh, thank you. Yes?
So, you know, a lot of, you know, as you were saying earlier, the ET is, you know, known as the worst game of all time. But I was just curious.
I've heard that opinion.
I was just curious, you know, considering some of the other things that Atari was doing at the time, and of course the video game crash of '83. You know, like for instance with Sword Quest, the supposed four-part series. You know, what would you say the biggest factor to that was, the actual crash?
The actual crash?
Yeah.
Okay, that's a great question. The question is, what's really the biggest factor of the crash? Well, I'd like to think that I single-handedly, with about 8K of 6502 code, brought down $1 billion industry. Don't think that's the case. And we happen to have the man here who did Pac-Man and some of the Sword Quest games. That's Todd. And between the two of us, you could say, well, you can't kill $1 billion industry by yourself. It takes two people to do it. So I could say that we did it, but I don't really think that's accurate. I think, and the movie Atari Game Over really looks into this and really goes into this, but I have to say that I think what it was business practices is the thing that does it. What happened was Atari was very aggressive, and that's a very euphemistic term, for the way they would deal with distributors and the way they would shove product down people's throats when they were on top and they could do it. And they really put the screws to a lot of people. So when you're on top, you can do that, and that's business, and that's the way it goes. And if you stay on top, and you're always, you know, in the driver's seat, well, that's the way business is. A lot of Microsoft competitors know that all too well, okay? But if the day ever comes where the tide turns, if you've been practicing those kind of business practices, then the people who want revenge will come back at you with both feet. And so I think what happened is that as the tide turned, as things like Pac-Man and E.T. and stuff that fell short of, you know, I'm not saying they were good or bad games, but they clearly did not meet consumer expectations, okay? So when that starts to happen and people start picking up the big ticket items from distributors, the distributors turn around and do everything they can to hurt you when they can. And I think that's the thing that really hurt Atari. That, and it was sort of like the fall of the Roman Empire. Atari was a place of tremendous excess. And that was sort of, that was the thing that made it great. You know, that's what made it a cool place to be, but it also made it a very volatile place to be. And ultimately, a place you couldn't be, because it wasn't there anymore. So I think, does I hope that sheds some light on it. Yes?
Is it true that you used to go around whipping people with a bullwhip?
That's an interesting question. Is it true that I used to go around whipping people with a bullwhip? That is not true. What is true? What is true is that I did used to walk around with a 10-foot bullwhip and crack it in the hallways and stuff, but I never hit anybody with it, except me once in a while. That was unfortunate. And in fact, there was a film crew that came by once when I happened to be walking around, because every once in a while you'd see a film crew at Atari who's in for doing some story. There was a film crew in one of the labs, and I happened to walk in, and there I am with the bullwhip, and there they are with the camera, and it's like, oh, let's talk to this guy. And so they looked at me and they said, so what's with the whip? I said, I said, the whip is for R&D. And they're like, yeah? I go, yeah, research and discipline. So, true story. But I never hit anybody with the whip. Yes.
You're known for putting Easter eggs in games. Did you have enough time to put even one Easter egg in E.T.?
Did I have enough time to put even one Easter egg in E.T.? Are there any Easter eggs in E.T.? Oh, yeah. Because there's always time for Easter eggs. And so Easter eggs are very important. I have a philosophy of Easter eggs, which is every game is going to have, Yars' Revenge has an HSW WSH in it, right? The reason it's HSW WSH, as I was just explaining, is to give you the key to know that Yar is really Ray and Razak is really Kazar. It tells you that you need to reverse words to figure out what's going on. At least that was going on in my head. I'm sure everyone who finally got an HSW WSH goes, oh, so that's what Yar is. Yeah, but it worked for me. So that was the thing, that was my first game. As a Raiders, I decided that in every game that I would do, there would be an HSW with a number next to it, and that number would be the number of the game. So there's an HSW2 in Raiders that you can find. And there's also going to be, every one of the main characters in my previous game is going to appear in the next game. So in Raiders, there's a way to go into one of the pits where you dig to find the treasure, and you can get a Yar to fly out of that pit in Raiders. So in E.T., in one of the pits, there's a flower that you heal, right? You heal the flower. But under the right circumstances, if you go in there in the first level of the game, and you heal the flower, and it turns into a Yar and flies out of the pit. And then if you finish that level and come back to the second level, you go back and heal the flower, and it turns into Indiana Jones from Raiders of the Lost Ark. And it just sits there, doesn't go anywhere, because they didn't have that much time. And then if you go around the third time and heal it again, you'll see in the score readout, it'll say HSW3, because E.T. was my third game, and there's an HSW. Also, there's a way that you can get the, the indicator in the upper right that tells you what the square you're standing on does. That will turn into a JMD, which is the name for, the initials for Jerome Demura, who did the graphics for E.T., so that's in there. And there's one other thing I did that was signature-wise, that if you really look carefully at the three phone pieces, when they're sitting in the wells, one of them is a messed up H, one of them is a messed up S, and the other one is a messed up W. So, yeah, I definitely put some Easter eggs in E.T. But I always said I would not spend much data on it. I had to, very little data went into the signatures, and basically not a lot of time. It wasn't hard to pop that kind of stuff in. Once you have the full game structure going on, throwing in a little thing like that and changing one pointer to go point to these graphics instead of that graphics, is really not a lot of work. But I always put the SIGs in last. I did do that. Oh, the redhead over on the side. What a fabulous looking woman you are.
Oh, thank you, sir.
Do you have a question?
I was wondering, you have so many fantastic stories. Will there be a book?
What a great question. Wow. I tell you honestly, if I would have planted someone in the audience, I would have asked them to ask that question. Absolutely, that's fabulous. As a matter of fact, I am writing a book. I'm working on a book that'll be out in a while, probably within the next 2 months, I'm hoping. It's going to be about a lot of shenanigans and stuff that we did at Atari, stuff from the dig, the whole E.T., I call it etiology. As a therapist, you got to say words like that. And that'll be out in 2 months. I just wanted to pop that. Oh, by the way, at HS Warshaw is my Twitter thing. So if you're going to follow me on Twitter, I always love it when my follow number goes up. I just get very excited about that, so make my day. Thank you. Be about 27, I think, right? What is that? Back here.
You talked about how when you're starting a game, you have the original concept for it, and probably maybe 15 to 20% of that actually goes into it if you're lucky. What was the original concept for E.T. that didn't make it in?
E.T. is a special case. That's a really good question. E.T. probably is going to be the highest percent of realization of the original concept of any of the games that I did. But the main reason for that is the threshold for that design was lower than almost any other game that I did, and I only had 5 weeks to decay the design, right? So it wasn't enough time to ruin it. Basically. So unfortunately, I delivered exactly what I planned. You know, I'll tell you an interesting ET story about the design of what it is, because what happened was I got a call. I literally was sitting in my office in the afternoon. It was a Tuesday afternoon, I believe that was the 27th of July, it was a Tuesday afternoon in 1982. If there are any autists in the audience, I'm sure you can bear me out on that. And so I got a call from Ray Kazar. Ray Kazar, the CEO of Atari, called me in my office. Actually, he didn't call me, because CEOs don't call you. Their secretaries call you. And I got a call on my phone, I answered the phone. Will you hold for Ray Kazar? Yeah, he signs my paychecks. Yeah, I'll do that. And Ray comes on, he goes, hey Howard, we need E.T. for September 1st, can you do it? And I'm like, yeah, I can do that, Ray. We will work this out. And what I didn't know was that he had already called George Gish, the director of our department, who had told him, no, nobody can do a game in 5 weeks. You can't have the game in 5 weeks. You should have told us earlier about this. You can't do this, Ray. And then he still called me, and I said, yeah, of course. What else am I going to say? But, I mean, the thing is, I didn't feel pressured because Ray's asking me to do that. I felt pressured to be able to do it. You know, I really wanted to make that work. That was very important to me. So I said, yeah, of course I can do it. I did a couple of really good games already. I can do anything. And that's where I was coming from. So that was cool. And he said, okay, he says, so Thursday morning, so basically 36 hours from now, be at the executive terminal in San Jose Airport. There will be a Learjet waiting for you. Okay. You know, that was fun to hear. And there was. And so I spent the next 36 hours whipping up a design, like I said, just a game that can be done. But me being who I am, it's not enough to just do a game that can be done, and I still have to innovate. I have to have something fresh, and so I did a 3D game, essentially. Right, E.T., I think, is still one of the first games that happens in a world that's on a cube, that maintains its position, you run around and do this, and I just thought, that's a cool idea. That's a cool thing to do, and it simplifies the game. Right? Because then I know certain actions happen on certain screens, and it gives you the illusion that the game is bigger than it is, and it's a very easy thing to program. Because on the screen, it looks like a whole different thing. In the computer, it's just at different pointers. It's not that big a deal to make another screen with the same kernel, away we go. So I try to do stuff like that to maximize, you know, the cost-benefit action in the game. So I laid out this design, got it all set, we go, and I get on the Learjet, and we fly over the mountains from San Jose to Monterey, where we stop, and just as the plane rolls to a stop, here comes this limo rolling right up the plane. It's like in a movie. And this was so cool. And out pops Ray Kazar, the CEO, Skip Paul, the chief legal counsel, and Lyle Raines, who I've usually got to remember not to say Claude Rains. I keep wanting to say that. But Lyle Raines, who was the guy who was going to be doing the coin-op version of E.T. that never happened. But he was going to do it, and those three were, because Monterey was where the negotiations with Spielberg were happening. And so we picked them up. Oh, well, we're just going to stop off and pick up a few people in our Learjet before we head on to Burbank. And away we go, and as we land in Burbank, and just as we're pulling up to a stop, here comes another limo. And so we get off the plane, on the limo, away we go to Warner Studios. And we're riding in the limo, and the limo has a sink in it. And I'm thinking, this is amazing. I've never seen shit like this. This is unbelievable. And Skip Paul goes up, and he tries the the water, it doesn't even have running water. This sucks. And I'm like, gratitude, dude. Jesus, some people are spoiled. And so that was amazing. And so we get to the studio. This is my second time in Steven Spielberg's office. The first time is a really good story. We'll come back to that in a moment. But the second time, so we go in there with the whole entourage, we go into Spielberg's office, which is basically like an apartment. And it's a very nice living room. He's got a game room off the side, a kitchen, and it's a really nice setup. A lot of people live in places that aren't as nice as this office. And here we are, and I'm just thinking, here's the guy who needs to approve something that I've got to kill myself for, and so I just hope he says okay. And so we get up, and here you go, Howard, what are we going to do? And I lay out the whole game. I say, this is it. It's a 3D world. We're going to do this. We're going to run around. We're going to find this stuff. And E.T. assembles the phone, and he calls home and meets the ship, and away we go. And there you go. So what do you think? And Steven Spielberg looks at me, and he goes, couldn't you do something more like Pac-Man? And I thought, oh my God. In my head, I'm like exploding. And what I wanted to say, my impulse was to say, well, gee, Steven, couldn't you do something more like The Day the Earth Stood Still? That's how much ego I had at that point. But I didn't say that, because this was Steven Spielberg. And so I said, well, Steven, I'd kind of like to do something special for this movie, because I think it's a special movie. And I think this is a game that we can do by September 1st. And I think having a game that's done is really a good thing in this case. And he went, that's okay. I guess he was a big Pac-Man fan. So that was the thing. I thought, like, holy crap, here's this guy who's like the biggest, one of the most innovative directors and people like this in a while, he does all this, and the first thing he wants me to do is knock off another game. And I thought, God. And then the other part of my brain said, this is Steven Spielberg, you really want to argue with him? So, and in retrospect, maybe that wasn't a bad idea. You have to keep that in mind also. The first time I went into Spielberg's office is an interesting story, though. That was when I was going to do Raiders. Well, they'd asked me to do Raiders, but Spielberg wanted to approve the person who was going to do Raiders. So I got a meeting. I had a meeting scheduled for 9:30 in the morning in Burbank at the studios, at Warner Studios, with Spielberg. And I was starting in San Jose, and there was no Learjet this time. I got to take a commercial flight at 6 a.m. and get down there and go through all this stuff. And I get to Warner Studios, I'm there at Spielberg's office, and I show up and I go, hi, I'm Howard. I'm the guy who's here for to see Mr. Spielberg. And they go, oh yes, that appointment has been moved to 3:30. Really? Okay. So I'm like, but then, because I'm a creative problem solver, at least I try to be. So I thought, okay. I just looked at him, I said, is it okay if I just kind of walk around the lot until then? And they said, sure. I said, yeah. Yeah, turning me loose in a Hollywood studio lot all day, unsupervised, nice. So that made for a good day. I stole stuff from the set of Fantasy Island. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I took little, souvenirs here and there. Nothing that would be missed on camera. But yeah, I just walked in and out of places that had red lights and places you probably weren't supposed to go. I ate in the commissary with all these people in costume and stuff. That was a cool day. That was a cool day. And so I got to hang out, and I thought, this is totally worth rescheduling the flights and all this stuff. And then I finally did actually meet with Steven Spielberg. So we're chatting and we're talking, we're having a lovely time. And I'm showing him Yar's Revenge, and because he wanted to see what I've done already. I'm showing him this, and he's digging the game, and we're talking. And then, I don't know why, but at some point I said to him, Steven, I said, I have a theory about you, about how you're really an alien. I said, would you like to hear it? And he goes, yeah, I'd like to hear that. So I proceeded to tell him this, because this was really my theory at the time. It was my idea that Steven Spielberg, that the aliens, if they're going to come and visit us, and like in the early 80s, it really had this feel of like we're going to make contact soon. You know, E.T. was out, Close Encounters had come out before, and Steven Spielberg had already made some movies, and they were very new, kind of different movies, because these were movies that really showed aliens as our friends and people we could connect with and contact with. And most of the alien exposure we had seen came from the B-movie science fiction, where we got to kill them first. And so it was a very different way to go, and these movies were tremendously popular. So I said to him, I said, you know, I really believe that when the aliens contact us, they're not just going to show up in the spaceship and go, hi, here we are. I said, they're probably going to be too smart for that. I said, what they're going to do is they're going to send a marketing team. And they're going to send a socialization team that's going to prepare us to meet them. And this team is going to have a production arm. I said, it's going to make these movies that show aliens in a new and much more positive and receptive light. And they're going to have a marketing team. And that marketing team is going to make sure these movies get seen everywhere in the world, in every language, all over the place, which his movies have. And so I said, so I really believe you're part of this team, that you're just part of the alien marketing team that's been sent to Earth to socialize us in preparation for meeting the aliens. And he just loved that. He just thought that was so cool. And so I got to do Raiders. And then a couple weeks later, I got a call from Games Magazine who said, hey, we heard you called Steven Spielberg an alien. That's true. I said, that's partially true. And so they said, well, he told us you had this quote for us, and I got quote of the month in Games Magazine, like in '82, for calling Steven Spielberg an alien. And that was fun. So that was the first day that was the first time I met Spielberg. And then I saw him the second time, and I saw him the third time when he approved E.T., and I haven't seen him since.
Oh.
There was a question over here.
Do you still play video games, and if so, what do you like?
I do. I do. It's a sad, sad thing. I am a hopeless, and not even recovering Candy Crush saga. Yeah, I'm like, you know, I'm really trying to crack like level 172, I think, at this point. It's really killing me. But I like a lot of handheld games. Gaming has undergone a very interesting thing. I think that one of the greatest games ever made, because a lot of times this question also comes up, is Grand Theft Auto 3 and Vice City. Woo! I think those games are amazing games. I think they have reprehensible theming, and yet I believe they are the best. If you just talked about a video game playing experience, I think they are the most innovative. I think they will serve as the jumping point between standard gaming as we always knew it and virtual reality ultimately, because I think they really bridged that gap in a brilliant way. And what they did was they did not innovate technically. The graphics, the program, the stuff that's in that game is not groundbreaking for the time by any means. But what they did was they innovated in game design. They made a good game. They took one playing surface. Instead of creating a whole bunch of different playing surfaces, they made one fairly complex playing surface and played the hell out of it so you knew that world. You really knew that location, and it worked. And mechanics that worked in some areas, even though they weren't mentioned, still worked in other areas. So you were given a mission and you had a lot of different ways to do it. And the things that make sense, like sometimes in a video game it's like, this is stupid. This is stupid. I can use this gun here, but I have to use that gun. I call that key and lock design, right? It's like there's only one tool that'll solve this problem in this place, even though logically, according to the way you play the game, all these other tools should work also. And I don't like that in game design. I think that's lame design. And what I found was, in this game, whatever mechanic it was that was available, it worked everywhere in the game in the way it was supposed to work, and you could do it. So if you got to kill the mob boss, you could plant a bomb in his car, you could shoot him far away, or you can run up and stab him, and you could do all these things. Now this is not casual conversation for the average individual. Well, I could kill him so many ways. It's so gratifying. But that's really good game design. That's really good game design to make a consistent, comprehensible world that works and keeps working. And I was very impressed with that. So I think that's one of the best games ever done. But what I think is really interesting about game design as it's grown is like games started console games like we did a long time ago. And then it grew and it grew and it grew and it grew into these huge monolithic games with huge teams required to do it. But then the one-screen games have come back. With handheld gaming and portable gaming, you now see a return of the original one-screen game. So in some ways, games have gone way into outer space. In other ways, they've circled back into where they were in the first place. So it came back to where it started. And having both of those going on simultaneously, I think is a beautiful thing. Because it says a lot about the fundamental action that we were creating originally. Right, that kind of gaming, the idea of a one-screen playable game that doesn't have to stop, it goes as long as you can play it, you just roll on with it. How high is up, that kind of game. And that's a fundamental type of gaming. And console gaming evolved sort of away from that, and to see that have a resurgence is very validating. I have to say. Just had your hand up for a while.
What was your original thoughts when Nintendo basically rejuvenated video games?
Hooray. I mean, the people who are in video games, I don't think any of us really believed for a second games were just a fad that was dead. It just didn't seem right. It was like too intense, it was too much, it was too much fun. You know, stuff like that doesn't disappear unless there's something really, really good to take its place, and heroin was already there, so.
Sure was.
Yes.
This ties into your one-screen thing you were talking about. Have you thought about going back and making any new games with the resurgence of the one-screen games?
I think about it, and then I wake up. But I do. I still have like a design for a sequel to Yours that I always kind of played with. I thought would be a really fun game, but I don't think I'm going to program a 2600 game again. I just don't think that's going to happen.
The limitations of the hardware versus...
No, I just don't want to sit down. That's not what I want to do with my time right now. You know, programming a 2600 is a very, very intense exercise, and I've done it. I've done the crap out of it. And it's like, but I'll tell you, a lot of people say, you know, wow, you become a therapist, and isn't that a weird transition? A lot of people look at me saying, going from an engineer, a software engineer, to a therapist, people see that as a very odd transition. And I don't think it is at all. Actually, if you think about it, we're all systems engineers. Right? It's just I've switched to a more complex system to work on. But it's still very much the same thing.
I was just wondering if you had a chance to go back and make new games, what platform would you make the games on? Because it seems like there would be a space on iOS mobile games for Yours Revenge sequel. I don't know if that would work with controls. Or I don't even know if you were so comfortable with the psycho therapist thing that maybe you're just not even worried about making games anymore. You're just on this new track.
Well, I might make games that make people psycho. I could always drum up some business. But it's true. I think if I were going to try and do a game now, I would probably go for a handheld platform kind of thing as opposed to a console thing. I was still doing console game development as late as 2009. And we did some Xbox Live stuff, and, you know, it's okay, but console gaming is like fun, but it's a whole different world now, and I think my heart is in the one-screen screamer, or a game that's a very small scenario that you just keep playing and playing and playing. So Saboteur is probably a good example of a game. If I were going to do another game, it would be something that's several screens, so it's not just one screen over and over, but a simple game, easy to play, that's just fun to roll with, and something, because there are games you need to commit your life to for a while. Right? And there's games that when you're waiting in the dentist's office for a while, you flip it out and you start playing for a little while because that's you're killing time. And I think a time killer, you know, because wasting time, that's always the highest form of endeavor. Right? So I think that's where my heart is. That's a good question.
I have a question about your therapy. How do you treat engineers?
Like anybody else who's brilliant and a little disconnected. I treat engineers like an engineer. You know, I'm able to work with engineers. A lot of see, there's a funny thing between therapists and engineers, and it's really not that fun. But what it is that engineers see therapists as these whacked out woo-woo space cadets who have no idea what the hell is going on. And in some cases they're right, but not all cases, right? Therapists think every single engineer has Asperger's or is on the spectrum. And that's it. They think they're autistic or they're Asperger's, and that's it. That's what they think. And in some cases they're right. but not always, okay? In fact, I don't treat people who are actually autistic and on the spectrum because I'm too hopeful, right? You know, it's like, but I specialize in engineers who are not there. If I get someone who's really like on the spectrum, I refer them out. But I think what's much more common among engineers is anxiety. Anxiety is a very big thing with engineers because there's a lot to worry about. People who are engineers have a concept they're trying to realize. And that's a big thing. That's a big thing. And a lot of therapists don't get that. But because I've done that, I get it. So I understand what's at stake for engineers. I also understand how unnecessarily you can drive yourself crazy and not necessarily help yourself in the process of achieving that goal. Right? So, because, you know, what's an engineer? You know, there are, you know, there's architects who design homes and there's carpenters who build homes, right? There's some people are implementers, some people are designers, and engineer is someone who's both. An engineer is someone who needs to come up with the idea, but it's not enough to come up with the idea. Right now you got to make it work, you got to see it happen. And that is a beautiful, beautiful thing that can drive you fucking nuts. Okay? So, if you'll excuse the expression, I shouldn't have said nuts.
I was wondering if you follow the hobbyist kind of homebrew scene for the 2600 and all, because you mentioned like you're not going to make Yards of Bench 2, but I think there's some guys out there that'd be happy to make it for you.
I do talk to people occasionally about that, and I'm still thinking about doing it. There's a couple of companies I've talked to, and some individuals who I think might do that. I would not rule it out, although we wouldn't be able to call it Yards 2. We'd probably have to call it Ray's Revenge.
See what you did there.
But people would know. Yeah, but it's possible. I would have someone else do a game like that, maybe consult on it. I would consider that. Absolutely, but don't think I'm going to program it.
Weren't there 2 Yar sequels, kind of? There's one on the flashback, was it? The flashback stand?
Well, the one on the flashback is Yars.
Oh, I thought it was called Yars 2 or something.
There was a PS3 game that was Yar's Revenge Secret. And what a piece of crap. I have to say. I mean, I would have loved, no, I'll tell you the truth. I mean, I would have loved to have that capacity when I was doing the game. But the thing that bothered me about that game, the first thing that bothered me about that game was nobody talked to me about the game. So I had nothing to do with that game whatsoever, and I'm happy to say that, given the game. But the other thing that really bothered me was a very important point of Yar's Revenge design-wise is to have freedom of motion and go wherever you're going to go and run around to do it. I only did it in 2 dimensions, they were doing it in 3 dimensions, but they made it a rail game. And the idea of turning Yar's Revenge into a rail game, to me, violated the basic idea of Yar's Revenge. You should be able to just run around and do whatever you want. You don't run a rail down the tunnel and then stuck over here. That's not, that wasn't the way I see Yar's. To me, Yar's is about freedom. It's not about restriction. And so that kind of bugged me with it. And also the other thing that bugged me was for a PS3 game, I think they could have done a lot better than what they did. So, but you know, I was managing some PS3 games at the time, so I wish my team would have done it. That would have been interesting. But you have to get someone to fund that too. That also would have been interesting. Yes?
Going back a little bit to the video game crash, I heard that supposedly there were like more copies of E.T. made than there were actually Atari systems. Is this true? And by a substantial margin, like 50% or something.
I don't think that's true.
So was that a common occurrence or was that unique?
No, there were 4 million. I think the first run of E.T. was 4 million, and I really don't think there was a second run, to tell you the truth. So, and there were more than 4 million in the installed base. Now, there may not have been 4 million active systems. A lot of these might have been in closets or stuff like that at this point, but they did not make more than the installed base. That's a fiction. Yes.
People could play Raiders or E.T. without an instruction manual?
That's a really good question and a good point. Nobody's going to be able to play Raiders without an instruction manual.
Not to interrupt, but I first played Raiders. My friend had a copy. He lost the instruction manual the day he got the game. It took us 2 years to figure out that the second controller is what you use for it. So technically, yes.
So, as I was saying, someone could play Raiders without a manual. No, thank you. I really appreciate that you put 2 years into it. That's great. I just don't want to be responsible for it. But no, I mean, that was a big question, and I actually didn't want Atari to put too many hints in the thing because I wanted it to be the adventure game, and they really did not listen to me about that. They said, no, we're going to put stuff in the manual, and they were right because this is pre-internet. Right nowadays, you can go and look up what to do on your game when you're stuck in your game, and that's great. That's a great thing to have. We didn't have that. You could also update a game. Imagine if ET would have been done recently, there would have been a few updates. You couldn't do that back then. So ET is going to be easier on some levels to figure out. There's a few things you can notice just running around that are consistent and keep going. Raiders, what a monster game to figure. I wouldn't want to figure that game out without the manual, and I programmed it. So it's like, cheers to you. I mean, that's like...
We filled a notebook with us just trying to figure out, okay, if you go here and you like, maybe you can use some parachutes, build a hole in the wall, all that stuff.
Oh, I'll bet, but you were able to get through it, though.
Yeah, 2 years of every day after school, that's all.
That's grit and determination. I gotta respect that.
This was just last year, actually.
What advice do you have for new indie developers?
For new indie developers?
Yeah.
I have some good advice for new indie developers. You need to be resilient. You need to be able to tolerate failure. Because I've heard there's 100 new games a day or something like that come out, and one of them will make any money. It's brutal. It's a brutal business because so many people can do it. It's the old thing, okay? So here's the thing. When it comes to writing a novel, making a movie and stuff like this, people who make movies and people who write books know that everybody thinks, if I can write a great novel, okay? If I could hold a camera and take a picture, I could make a great movie. Everybody believes that because really all you need to do to write a great novel is write the words in sequence, and there you go. That's all there is to it. So with a video game, if you have access to the tools to create some moving graphics on a screen, you can make a fantastic video game. And that's true. But for some reason, not everyone who can writes a great novel. And not everyone who can make a video game can make a great video game. So although it's true that 100 games come out like a day or something like that, most of them suck. I mean, they really, really suck because they're done by people who don't really know what they're doing. Because having the capacity to do something does not mean you can do it well. So if you're an indie developer, I'm assuming you're someone who's really focused on doing it well and has some background with it and is really focused on it. Because if you're not, then the best advice I could have is do something else, right? Because that's going to be a tough way to go. But if you're really focused and this is where you're at, this is where your heart's at, and this is really what you want to do, you need to remember that you're working in a long-range goal of trying to create some product that's going to work, that's going to entertain people. And you need to learn to tolerate failure. If you go into that with the expectation that we're going to change the world with our next game, all I need is to do the next Angry Birds. Yeah, that's all you need to do. But if your first Angry Birds doesn't work, and your second Angry Birds doesn't work, and your 15th Angry Birds doesn't work, are you still an indie game developer? If you are, you're going to do 20 of them. You're going to do 40 of them. You're going to keep doing the stuff, and you're going to keep learning from where you were to see what you can do. See, the thing about software and making games is a very special part of software, okay? Because most software development, the vast majority of software development, is about here's a spec, write a program that implements this spec. And there are people who think that's challenging, but they are wrong, okay? Because if you have an objective spec to meet and you are writing code, usually you know what code does, and if you can see a way to implement what it is you're trying to do, bingo, you do it. And if it meets the spec, if you do what was expected of you, then you're done. And you did a fine job, and it works. Video games are a little different, okay? With video games, you have 100% of the challenge of any programming task. You still have to meet a spec, and the spec is your game design. But the kicker in video games is that at the end of the product, it has to be fun. And that's a subjective standard you're meeting. Most programming has to meet an objective standard. And so you can say, people say, you can't say, well, it didn't show up with a carriage return. What, the lights didn't go on when I hit this button, or they did. Okay, if they did, it works. If they didn't, it doesn't work. But there's no subjective there. In games, it has to work and it has to be fun. And that have to be fun thing, that is a really tough requirement to meet. in software, right? So you've got to remember that if you're a game developer, you are first and foremost an entertainer, right? And then you're a software developer. I think if you hold that and you maintain your resiliency, that's it. You got to remember that failure is not an end, right? Failure is a launching point. Because one of the themes of my whole practice is I'm the Silicon Valley therapist, right? And I work in Silicon Valley, which means there are people all around me, everywhere, who are failing every day. And they're failing for millions and millions of dollars. And it sucks, and they are unhappy about it. Because they were going to be the one buying the big mansion and putting all the stuff together, and now they see the neighbor who's moving out to that, and they're not making it. People fail a lot in that. And they're strong, good, intelligent people, okay? So it's like, you've got to learn to tolerate failure if you're going to succeed. It may sound weird, but it's true. And so what I just tell people is, hey, I can help you deal with failure, because who better, than someone who made one of the epic fails of our time, right? I made a failure so big, they made a movie out of it. So, 2 movies, actually. Yeah, so it's, so does that answer your question?
Yes, I'd say so.
You still want to do games?
In the middle of one.
Rock on.
Yeah.
4 minutes left.
Oh, we're running out of time. Who has the last question? Or next to last question, if it's a short question. Yes.
You said earlier you had ideas about a Yars 2.
I did.
Have you ever thought of ideas for an ET2?
I'm not sure I thought of ideas for an ET1. Any other questions? That's a good place to end. Yes?
I gotta ask this real fast.
Sure.
ET notwithstanding, what's the worst game of all time, in your opinion?
Honestly, the worst game, all I can say is the worst game I ever played. I can't say it was the worst game of all time. The worst game I ever played, honestly, was Charlie's Angels on the GameCube. It was so bad. I mean, it was just so bad. And it was worse than E.T. Got it here first. Thank you very much. I'll be like right outside or whatever, and I have like a limited number, like I said, of a few Once Upon Ataris. Check me on Twitter. That's it, @HS Warshaw, and thank you very much for coming. I really appreciate it.